Sociology Robot. Hello and welcome to the second video lecture on OCR A Level Sociology, Paper 1, looking at norms and values. In the last video lecture, we looked at the idea of culture and cultural differences, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that and look at the building blocks of culture. What is it that makes a culture? First of all, we have norms. Now, norms are the correct way of behaving in a way that's in line with cultural expectations. A great example of this is how you greet people when you meet them for the first time. In British and American culture, strangers will shake hands. But in some Asian cultures, bowing is the norm. Now, when people go against norms, they're often viewed as deviant. This is sometimes funny, but it can also be confusing or shocking or frightening for people. The important thing to remember is that norms are behaviours. They are things that you physically do. And this means that you can go along with the norm, even if you think it's silly or pointless. You just have to go through the motions and you keep everybody happy. Norms change over time. Think about dress codes, the way people used to dress a couple hundred years ago or 500 years ago, and the way they dress today. And that out-of-date norms often seem silly, and that reveals something important about culture, that when you are inside a culture, the norms seem sensible, obvious, but from the outside, norms often look quaint or ridiculous. Norms can be formal or informal. Formal norms are written down. They're like the official rules of a business or a club or a sport. If you break these norms, often there'll be punishments. Other norms are much more informal. It's kind of agreed upon by everybody how you're supposed to behave, and if you break these norms, then maybe you get dirty looks or people start avoiding you. Norms can also be divided into two other categories of mores and folkways. Mores are very strong moral norms, and that when people go against a culture's mores, the reactions tend to be quite severe disapproval, and very often the people who do this, if they're part of the culture, will feel shame. Folkways are more informal and low-key. They're just the established ways of doing things, how you're supposed to greet people, the topics you're supposed to talk about. So in Britain, people who know each other might meet on the street and say hello. They might exchange some comment about the weather, how nice it is, how nasty it is. And if you don't do this, if you walk straight on by, then people will feel a bit snubbed and they might think that you're being rude. Values are a little different from norms because values are the correct way of thinking and feeling and believing. For example, British people are often said to value fairness and tolerance. They're said to be great lovers of pets and the countryside. Maybe if you go to other countries, you might find different values going on there. Americans value success and patriotism. Some other countries might be a little baffled by the British sentimentality about pets. People who reject cultural values are also seen as deviant, but in a deeper sort of sense. You can go against the norms of a culture simply because you're ignorant and you don't know the correct way of behaving. But if you go against the values of a culture, you're more likely to be seen as wicked or sinful. You might notice a bit of a connection then between values and those norms that are called mores, those very important morally charged norms. And again, it's important to remember that values are beliefs, and we can't read each other's minds, so we don't really know what values other people have. It's easy to conceal your values and pretend to go along with what other people think. It's probably occurred to you that norms are based on values, that norms really are the values a culture has put into action. And many sociologists would agree with this understanding. But it leaves us with a wider question of where norms and values come from, what creates them. And here we can look at two possible answers: materialism and non-materialism or idealism. A materialist explanation of norms and values would say that they are based on the physical surroundings that a culture exists in. For example, the geography, the available resources, the climate, wealth, things like that. So if you are living, for example, in a part of the world which doesn't have a lot of valuable resources and has quite a harsh climate, then you might develop norms and values rather differently from people who live in an extremely fertile and safe part of the world with a gentle climate. The non-materialist or idealist view of culture is that norms and values come from the human mind. They're generated by brilliant thinkers, by insightful visionaries, through religious movements and political movements. Later on, you'll look at some perspectives in sociology, and the Marxist perspective comes down on the materialist side of this debate, viewing norms and values and culture generally as a product of material circumstances, particularly wealth. Let's take a quick think about how these ideas reflect in real life. This is known as A-2 application. Britain today, along with most European countries and the United States of America and many other places, is a multicultural society. And this means it is home to several distinct cultures that coexist with each other. Some of these cultures have been present in the British Isles for a long time. Others have arrived more recently through immigration. Now, multiculturalism is the view that this sort of mixed society is desirable. The opposite of a multicultural society is a homogeneous society. Homogeneous means all made of the same thing. Another word for that is a monoculture. Now, what views should we take of multiculturalism? Well, here are a number. One view is the idea of Leitkultur. This is a German word, and it means guiding culture or perhaps core culture. It's the idea that out of this multicultural mix, there is going to be one culture that is and should be dominant. Another view is the melting pot. This is an idea from the United States that immigrant cultures merge together into a blend. Now, of course, the largest group will have the biggest effect on the blend, like the main ingredient in a recipe. As more immigrants arrive and as some groups grow through having high birth rates, then the blend will change. Living in a melting pot can mean that your own culture gets swamped out if you're in the minority. Then there is the salad bowl. This is a more common idea in the UK. The idea of the cultures keeping their distinctive way of life, but living alongside each other and everybody respecting everybody else. No cultural group is more important than any other one, although sometimes some groups might need some special help if they're experiencing particular oppression or hardship. Since 2002, immigrants to the United Kingdom have had to sit a test called Life in the United Kingdom. It consists of 24 questions on British culture, norms and values. And this idea is very much taken from Leitkultur. However, there have been a lot of criticisms of this test. It is often said to include questions that even people who have lived in Britain for their entire lives would not know the answer to. Is there an interesting piece of research into norms and values? Well, yes, there is, by the sociologist Harold Garfinkel. Garfinkel was an interactionist sociologist, and we'll learn more about what interactionism means later in the course. But he carried out a number of clever experiments in his book Studies in Ethnomethodology that was published in 1967. And he created these things called breaching experiments. Now, a breaching experiment is a behaviour carried out in public that deliberately breaches the norms of a particular society. For example, Garfinkel might get an actor, a man in a very conventional business suit, to skip down the sidewalk in America like a little child. And he would observe that people would stare with surprised expressions. He also got people to take part in games like noughts and crosses, or tic-tac-toe, as they call it in America. But he would have an actor who would deliberately play the game wrong, putting the noughts and the crosses outside of the boxes or on the lines and not in the boxes themselves. And Garfinkel would observe to see how the other player reacted when the rules weren't followed. And of course the other player would be amazed and dumbfounded, sometimes angry at this misbehaviour. They certainly wouldn't know how to react to it. And this tells us a lot about the importance of norms for enabling us to function together, and how people become disturbed when norms are broken. So, to summarise, we have looked at norms as behaviour that is considered acceptable in a culture, and we've looked at some particular norms that are formal and informal, and we've looked at examples of mores and folkways. And we've looked at values, which are the guiding beliefs of a culture. We've considered materialist and non-materialist or idealist explanations for where norms and values come from, and we've looked at the idea of a multicultural society, which will have many different norms and values coexisting within it, and different ways that people have tried to make a multicultural society work, including light culture, the melting pot, and the salad bowl. Finally, we considered Garfinkel's groundbreaking studies in ethnomethodology and his breaching experiments that revealed how people respond when norms are broken. Let's look at exam questions. Question 1. Question 1 is a short 6-mark question. It will be phrased like this: explain, using examples, the concept of, and then you might get norms or values. You should answer a question like this with a description of what norms and values are, maybe mentioning formal and informal and folkways and mores and deviance and people's responses. And you should give some examples. But remember, your example shouldn't just be a simple list. You should pick 2 or 3 examples and explain why this is a norm or why it is a value, probably by saying what people would do if this norm or this value was broken. Question 2. Question 2 is a double-sized version of question 1. It's worth 12 marks. But the difference is that it includes 2 sources. Source A is usually a picture, and source B is normally a short paragraph of writing, maybe 50 words. A question might be phrased: using sources A and B and your wider sociological knowledge, explain the concept of norms or values. Here you're going to write an answer very similar to what you'd write for question 1, including your own definition and your own examples. However, you will also need to go through source A and source B, picking out examples of norms or values in them. With the picture, you say what you see. You describe what's going on in the picture and why that is an example of a norm or a value at work. With the passage, you need to quote from the passage and then explain why this is a norm and why it is a value. Question 3. Question 3 Is the essay question worth 20 marks and you should spend at least 20 minutes in answering it? It might be phrased, outline and briefly evaluate the view that, and then a view will be given to you. For example, the view that norms in British society are changing, or the view that values in British society are shared by most people. I recommend answering a question like this by building 3 large paragraphs, making 3 broad points. Maybe the idea that norms are changing and an example of that, and perhaps an argument that norms are not changing, and an example of some norms that have stayed consistent for a long time. And maybe some argument about what happens when norms are broken and how people react to that, and Garfinkel's study would be very useful there. What you need to do for this question, unlike the previous 2, is evaluate. So it's important to have a discussion about whether this is right or wrong, are norms changing, are values shared. You could either do this by putting a short paragraph at the end, or you could put a little comment at the end of each of your 3 paragraphs, discussing whether or not there is strong evidence or likelihood for this. I hope this has been helpful for you. We'll be continuing next lesson with a look at functionalism as an explanation of cultural differences. If you want to read more, my study guides are available on Amazon, including Study Guide 1, which covers socialization, cultural identity, and a combined study guide for this topic with the youth subcultures option. You can find links for those in the description. Sociology Robot.